Good evening. I'm Adam Wathen. I am the Associate Director for System-Wide Services here at Johnson County Library, and I really want to thank you for joining us this evening. I'm glad to welcome you to tonight's program, Addressing Gun Violence in the Public Spaces. I'd like to thank all the participants on the panel tonight for bringing their voices to the table, and I'd like to thank all our partners and our sponsors who made this program possible. I'm particularly glad that we can host a conversation like this in the library. Libraries are places for community voices, and we stand by our mission to provide access to ideas, information, experiences, and materials that support and enrich people's lives. Libraries provide spaces where individuals can express their opinions, where people can find a broad variety of voices in our collections, and where the community can gather to dialogue about our viewpoints and work toward creating the community that we want Johnson County to be. I'm glad the library can play this role. It's one that we're very intentional about, and that is evidenced by the way that we can host a discussion like this in a public space. I invite you all also to discover the voices that are in our collections. If you don't have a library card already, please do talk to somebody with a red lanyard. We'll be glad to get you a free library card that you can use to access our resources. And now I'll turn it over to Ambassador Alan Katz, founder of American Public Square.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the library for hosting this program tonight, all of our panelists and our moderator. And I really want to thank all of you. American Public Square started about 8 years ago, and we used to have rooms full of people like this, and then when this terrible thing called COVID came along, and suddenly we were all looking at screens. And so I have to tell you that it's, for me at least, it's really very heartening that we are able to have a program like this that's full of people. I think this is an important program because the times we live in are very fraught, and I think it's important that we learn not only to hear what someone else is saying, but also sort of learn and help teach other people how to listen to someone else and not assume that they're the enemy because we don't agree with them. And I think that's a lesson that we at American Public Square try to put forward, and I think that it's certainly as timely as any message we possibly could have. This program tonight is the second in what we call Kansas City at the Square. We had one over across the state line in April, and we're happy to bring this one over here to Johnson County. The person that has been responsible for this is Alana Mueller, who is our community director, and she is overseeing the KC at the Square programs, and I want to thank Alana for the job that she has done. And I'm going to stop talking now because you didn't come to hear me talk. I would like to introduce Alana Mueller to come tell you about what's going on in the program tonight. Thank you all for being here.
I have to tell you, off script, sorry, to see a room so full, I mean, my heart is full. I'm so grateful to each of you for trusting us and for coming out for this very important conversation. I noticed there's a lot of people standing. We do have a couple of chairs left over on the far side of the room, so please feel free. We also have some overflow chairs, and we're going to open these doors. So thank you all so much for being here. As Alan said, I want to welcome you to tonight's second in the KC at the Square series. You know, the topic of addressing gun violence in public spaces is indeed an important one. It takes into account that most citizens, I know all of you, deplore the mass gun violence that is plaguing our nation. However, Second Amendment advocates fear that their rights could be limited if gun laws are changed. As the standoff continues, death tolls are increasing, anxiety levels are rising, and citizens of all ages are nervous about going into public spaces, such as schools, houses of worship, retail stores, and dare I say, libraries. What's the answer when it comes to addressing this situation? I hope that our distinguished panel can help shed some light on this topic. I want to thank our program sponsors and partners for tonight. We could not do this work without them. So specifically, I want to thank Stevie and Jeff Brick, who are here tonight, Mindy Corcoran and Len Lowson, who I know are watching from Florida. Hi, guys. Forward OP, the Johnson County Library, Johnson County Mental Health Center, Ogletree Deacons, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, Marnie and John Sherman, United Community Services of Johnson County, and William Jewell College. Join me in giving them a big thank you. As with all American Public Square programming, we welcome requested fact checks and questions. You can ask them of our esteemed panel. You'll notice that at the ends of your rows, I believe, were some cards. If you need a card and don't have one, we can certainly supply them to you. For those attending in person, please fill out one of these. If you're online and watching us from afar, you can feel free to use the Q&A feature in the chat section of your screen, and we have somebody who will be monitoring that here tonight. Our roving reporter tonight, who will be gathering and curating those questions, is Savannah Hawley. Savannah is the general assignment reporter for KCUR. Our fact checkers, who you'll see at the end of the row here, are both from the Johnson County Library. Please meet Ashley Fick, the civic engagement librarian, and Amanda Wallmeyer, who is the local history librarian. As with all of our major events, we're pleased to provide you access to a fact sheet. The link to the fact sheet can be found on our website at americanpublicsquare.org. You'll notice that also you may have scanned the QR code. You can feel free to use that as well. But what that will do is, I'll tell you that our panelists have all seen that fact sheet. They all think that it's a good sort of basis of information in case you do have questions about tonight's topic. Lastly, a few of you in the audience have access to a civility bell. You have an important job to do tonight. If you sense that the conversation is getting heated, if our panelists get rowdy, if the conversation is less than civil, I hope you'll do this and stop the conversation. Our panelists understand that it is a tradition at American Public Square that if a bell is rung, the conversation pauses, tensions are cooled down, everybody takes a deep breath, and then we carry on. We continue the conversation. So let's hear some of those bells. I know they're out there. All right. Excellent work. Excellent work. With that, I want to turn it over to our wonderful moderator for this evening, McClain Bryant Macklin. McClain is the Director of Policy and Strategy Initiatives at Health Forward Foundation. And again, she'll serve as the moderator for tonight's program. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, everyone. I want to echo thanks for you all being in attendance tonight and participating in this very important discussion. And to think we worried about whether or not we'd have a good crowd. It should have been no surprise. This is a very important issue, as has been said. And I'm going to go right into introducing our illustrious panel. I think many of whom you know. I saw them work in the room and shaking hands and giving hugs. So all toward a friendly environment, which is the ethos of this organization, and so we'll keep it light and keep it civil. On my left, we have Caleb Daniels, the marketing coordinator for Frontier Justice, and those of you who got here early, you might have seen his headshot. It's by far the coolest one. We also have Reverend Adam Hamilton, founding pastor of United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. To his left, we have Representative Joe Elahoy from Kansas's 17th District. Next to her, we have Clark Prophet, journalism student at MU. And then to the far left, we have Jaron Raven, president and CEO of Swope Health. All right, we're gonna get right into some level setting, kind of hitting the topic high. Why are we discussing gun violence? And I'll start with Reverend Hamilton. The issue of gun control has become commonplace at kitchen tables and mass media discussions. Why is that? Why is this topic so important?
Well, I'll just say why it's important to me. So I've been at Church of the Resurrection 32 years. We have a large congregation, about 22,000 people. And during that period of time, I've officiated at too many funerals for people who died as a result of the use of guns. So 32 suicides, and about half of those involved guns. Teenagers, but also middle-aged men and a whole host of other people in between. Many of you know Erin Langhofer, who died at First Fridays, and I officiated at her funeral, and her dad is one of our pastors. A stray bullet from kids who were angry and began firing. Some of you know and remember Reed Underwood's death, and his grandfather, Bill Corcoran, and I officiated at their funeral. They were active parts of Church of the Resurrection. I have people whose names I won't tell you, but murder-suicides with men who got angry with their wives who needed a divorce because of domestic violence and ended up killing their wives and killed themselves after that. And you do enough of these over a period of time and you say, surely we can find some solutions. We can find some way to address this. And half of my members own guns and the other half don't. But it matters. And I see faces when I think about this, and I think we're smart enough, we should be able to find some solutions to help.
Caleb, this next one's for you. Building on Reverend Hamilton's comments, from your point of view, why is addressing gun violence important, and do you think about it as a professional in the firearms industry?
Absolutely. I think I'm disappointed by the framing of that question to begin with, because I'm often asked by someone who spent the last 7 years of my life in this industry if I care or if I even think about this. I don't live in a bubble. I'm not non-cognizant of what happens in the world, and neither is any of the amazing people that I've worked with and grown up with in this industry. So what it's done for us is given us the opportunity and perspective. Like I said, I've been in the industry for 7 years, and I know I look like I'm 12, so that's been 17 to 25 for clarity there. And I think that's been really important for me because I've watched people from all demographics come to me for help, to learn, and to grow. And so being in the industry gives me this unique perspective where I've watched people from all backgrounds, and I've seen things, I've heard from people, and I've watched them. And I think it's really important because for me and for us, being a part of this dialogue is so important because violence is a non-unique problem to firearms. And I find that when we funnel in on a tool versus the actual issue at hand, you know, for instance, just as an example there, we don't even rank in the top 10 nations in the developed world from the Crime Research Institute, or Prevention Research Center, pardon me, for mass public shootings, either in death rate or frequency. And yet because of botched research, studies, and aggressive pushing from the media standpoint, it's been shown to be the worst thing in America. And the reality is, a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth even puts its shoes on. That's Mark Twain. And that's really how I feel about this issue. We can race to the bottom every day of the week, and we can blame every firearm and blame every tool and make small whittling away changes from magazine bans to safe storage laws, etc., and see no real effect on violent crime. So I think it's important to talk about so we can find real solutions.
Jaron, I'm coming to you. You've got a unique perspective as a public health professional. What are the reasons you believe we've seen an increase in gun violence?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So certainly the last 3 years, there's an increase in 3 specific things that lead to gun violence or violence generally: isolation, anxiety, and depression. Right? If you think about those 3 things, most of us get up every day and we're creatures of habit and routine. We pretty much do the same thing daily. The last 3 years, there's been a massive shift and changes, and typically we don't do well with change, with large-scale change. Most of every infrastructure, labor markets, employment, transportation, things that we engage daily have had massive complications and changes. And that leads to depression, that leads to anxiety. The other thing that I mentioned is there's a discussion happening right now about inflation. And I'm bringing that up because inflation, we're not having the discussion the right way, right? So inflation means that obviously things are getting more expensive, but what's really happening is most of America's gotten poorer. And there's a correlation between poverty and gun violence. And so those are the things that I think are the reason why we're seeing a significant increase in crime, particularly concentrated in poor areas.
I just want to stress the beauty in having such a dynamic panel that can address this issue from a variety of perspectives. And coming to you, Representative Hoy, I'm very curious to know what's the tone of conversations amongst you and your colleagues in the Kansas legislature, and can you share with us a little about what it is that you talk about when it comes to gun violence and how you respond when there's an act of gun violence in Kansas?
Overall, the tone, I think, is one similar to this, respectful, and we listen to one another. But I also have a perspective of coming into office after having advocated in the Capitol for a number of years on gun violence prevention and talking about gun laws before I had a seat at the table as a member of the Federal and State Affairs Committee that hears most of our gun laws. So I was able to know what it's like to be the one addressing the committee and sitting on the committee. And I can tell you, anybody should feel comfortable coming in and testifying at your state house because we're just as nervous as you are. Everybody, it's talking in front of a crowd, getting your point across on a sensitive issue isn't easy. So I think that's why we're able to maintain that respect and civility, because we all are passionate about the issue one way or another. And the chair of that committee was very responsive to this issue, even though we don't agree. We always say we may disagree, but we're never disagreeable. And in fact, did provide a hearing for a domestic violence bill that I had worked on and introduced as a committee bill. And I think that hearing from survivors of gun violence is impactful for state lawmakers. I had colleagues, I'm a freshman lawmaker, though there were people there who had never heard stories like this from Kansans before. And it makes you think in a different way when you're not just looking at a stat or hearing about high-profile mass shootings. That's not what all gun violence in America is. There's domestic violence. These situations often occur in the home. There's suicide, unintentional shootings. And so hearing the daily impact of the stories from real, true Kansans and what their life is like now, and the fact that many of these, most all of these are preventable situations, I think it keeps us all pretty level-headed and ready to have an open mind and listen.
Clark, your generation is unique in sort of the level of exposure to technology that's much greater than any generation before. You all have also been more exposed to incidents in the media of gun violence and of mass instances of gun violence in particular. And just curious, how does it feel to you as a member of Generation Z to see a video of a shooting taking place?
That's a good question. The answer that I would like to tell you, and I feel like you maybe would be expecting to hear, is I'm afraid, and it bothers me. And it, of course, bothers me, but I don't really know if I can say I'm afraid anymore, as I'm just so numb to everything that I see on the news and on my timelines and everything like that. It's become routine waking up every day and getting on Instagram and seeing anything you can pull out of a hat concerning violence. And it's exhausting being so exhausted, having to think about these things and talk about these things and, you know, join groups and clubs and coalitions on fighting back against our own government and things of that sort. So I'm tired, honestly. Like, I'm tired of sitting here, and I'm sure all of you guys are tired of sitting here and being exhausted and talking about these things and worrying about your family and your kids and anybody who can be affected by this, because it's also one of these conversations that it's maybe a little bit more faded in your mind and you're not as worried about it until it happens to you or until it happens to somebody you love. So tired, in short.
Understandably. So shifting a bit to the meat and bones of this conversation, personal protection and public safety. Caleb, what are the most common misconceptions about armed self-defense in America?
Absolutely. So what I find when we talk to people that aren't familiar with the shooting sports or self-defense or concealed carry or what that even looks like is, you know, there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of fear, and that's understandable if you're not familiar. Fear of the unknown is absolutely the biggest fear of them all. And I think it comes from a level of complacency in our society today. The reality is, for a lot of individuals, they feel that it's unnecessary, it's outdated, it's archaic to have this idea that personal protection is your personal obligation, that someone else is, their role in society is to ensure that you are safe. And the tragedy of that framing is that it's simply not true. It's been proven time and time again in the court of law that nobody has an obligation to protect your own life except you. If you recall, after the Parkland massacre, where we watched law enforcement officers stand outside and do nothing, they were taken to court by the parents of the individuals who were slaughtered. The case was thrown out, as constitutionally, law enforcement has no obligation to protect your life unless you are in their custody. Simple as that. You are your own first responder, and that is the objective truth of the world. And the biggest tragedy of that is this idea of what we call in the industry the clock of death, which is the average time a violent crime is versus your average response time for law enforcement. Average violent crime is 3 minutes or less. Average response time in KCPD, only 1 out of 6 precincts report an average of less than 6 minutes for a priority call. And the tragedy is in the majority of counties in America where this is so prevalent, like Chicago, Baltimore, DC, it's significantly more than that. The unfortunate reality is people are there to avenge you legally, not to protect you in the moment. And the other thing that we like to hear, that we hear a lot, is this is some sort of anomaly. It doesn't exist. It's a straw man argument that someone can protect you. And of course, when you hear things in the media like the mall shooting in Indiana where a 22-year-old courageously saved lives by stopping a shooting in less than 15 seconds, it supports that, right? That it's a straw man. It only happens once every while. But the reality is the CDC in 2013 told us that minimum we see 500,000 or 300,000 to 500,000 to 3 million, pardon me. I like making sure these are correct. The minimum annually defensive gun uses. That's quite a substantial number. So the point being is, regardless of political posturing, statistics that are from studies that are misconstrued, or any sort of crime that occurs, this is your natural right, and it can't be infringed.
Reverend Hamilton, what are you and other clergy doing, or what have you done, in response to increasing gun violence in public spaces? As a pastor of a large congregation, you have people on both sides of many issues, including this one. So what have you asked your congregation to do?
Sure. Well, we've surveyed our congregation a couple of years. Actually, I've done this twice. A couple of years ago, it was 5,200 of our folks, 48%. 5,200 who took the survey, 48% who are gun owners. And we just asked about some simple common sense things and said, you know, how do you feel about these things? And what we found, there was overwhelming agreement on the part of both gun owners and those who don't own guns about certain things. They said, these things seem to make sense to us. And I'll just mention a couple of those. And after Uvalde, this was Pastor Emmanuel Cleaver III and I and some other clergy then called for our congregations to be able to speak up about these things. And so these are just a few. 85% of our folks who own guns said that they agree that people should pass a basic gun safety course before receiving a permit to carry a gun. I have a place at the Lake of the Ozarks, and my younger brothers and sisters came down last week, and I told them you can't drive the wave runners unless you pass the Missouri safety test. That's a law in Missouri, to drive a wave runner. And these are my siblings that are in their 30s, early 30s. And I think it's interesting that we have to take a basic test online and pass it before you can drive a wave runner on a lake, but then you can buy a gun and not have to take a gun safety class. And the NRA has a really great gun safety course out there. And I think let's figure out, or maybe your organization probably does too, but figure out what's a great gun safety course. And let's make sure that people, before we give them the ability to have a weapon that they're going to defend themselves with or use in some other way, that they actually know how to use it well, how to store it safely. So that's just one example, but you know, there's a host of others that we talked about. How do you store your guns safely, and making sure that people are doing that well. When people decide to, in the moment, take their own lives, you have a 2% chance of succeeding in taking your own life if you're overdosing on drugs, and an 85% chance of succeeding if you are using a handgun. And so can we store these better and more safely, especially if you're an adult gun owner and you have kids? And I think your organization supports that same idea as well. And I know the NRA does, and says, you know, this is important that we store these things well, and we have some idea of how to do that. Anyway, those are the kinds of things. There are a whole host of others I could mention, but straw man laws, and looking at, you know, in the case of 2 of my members who were killed at the Jewish Community Center some years ago, you know, a man shouldn't have been able to buy a gun, had his friend buy them at Walmart, guns that he used to commit this crime and kill 2 of my members on Palm Sunday a few years back. And in the end, the penalty, I think, for that crime was a minimal penalty. And so being able to say, look, there's a much serious and harsher penalty if you're going to buy a gun for somebody who shouldn't have a gun. And it shouldn't be a $100 fine and a year of community service or something. I don't remember the exact penalty, but it was shocking how small it was. Those are the kinds of things that I think we should be looking at to say, here's some basic things we should be able to agree about. And at least in our congregation, most gun owners do agree that these are things that could make a difference. Is it going to solve all the problems? Of course not. But there are some ways in which this should help. And so anyway, we had our folks sending letters to Congress saying, these things are important to us, and we're going to ask you, please do something about it. And you know, I'm not saying it was our congregation and the others, but there were hundreds of churches across the country who took those letters, and their members sent them in to say, please act, please do something. And so that's just one example of what we tried to do.
Caleb?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to provide context to those three because I think they're really important points. I'll work backwards since we kind of went in that order. For the straw purchasing, I remember when I turned 17 and I started working in the industry, one of the first things we talked about was the minimum federal penalties for straw purchase, which is 10 years in federal prison. Full stop. If you're convicted of that, it is that, and I believe a $500,000 minimum fine. We have that posted all around our store to deter people from attempting to do so at every register. We talk about it with clients. I myself have prevented a number of firearm transactions back from the days when I was in high school and college and working the sales floor versus being on the corporate side of the house, where you'd see people come in and, for instance, be touching the glass in my store through their shirt and taking photos and trying to send them to their friends. And suddenly someone would come in 5 minutes later incredibly interested in that particular firearm. And those are the most basic examples of how obvious it can be, but it can also be a lot more nuanced. I can see a father and a son come in, and it seems like the son, who is of legal age, isn't the one buying the gun, even though it absolutely seems to be for him. And we've turned those down as well. It creates a little backlash on occasion. People get frustrated, but it's our obligation under the law. We are criminally liable if we fail to protect a straw purchase from occurring. On safe storage laws, this is one of the exact reasons in the previous point that I made about why we don't want to focus on issues that we can't do, because it's this theory called hollow hope. Essentially, we spend a lot of time, equity, and conversation on legislation that could work in a short term, but in reality is going to fail constitutional muster and create serious issues. In the Heller case in 2008, two things came out of that were really important. One, it stopped the handgun ban in DC. And two, part of that requirement of him having a handgun in the home was a trigger lock, a safe storage law. Both of those were struck down in that Supreme Court case as being unconstitutional, as it violated the citizen's right to have effective and rapid access to a firearm for self-defense. I do support safe storage of firearms and safes. We sell them frequently. We have a flyer and brochure at all of our stores, the 8 things we recommend buying with your firearm. One of the most primary things we recommend is a safe. Every handgun in America that is sold from a federal firearms licensee comes with a bore lock by law. We do everything we can in those respects that are within the bounds of the Constitution and the law. And in terms to education prior to, some people don't have the convenience of time. I've worked with individuals who are elderly, who have, they're widowers, for instance. I distinctly remember this one older lady when I was maybe 19, and she came in on the verge of tears because someone had just broken into her home the night previously, and there was threats that it would happen again. And she needed to know how to be safe within her home. And she needed a tool that fit her properly, regardless of a double rotator cuff surgery and severe arthritis in the hands. I sold her a firearm, I took her out to the range, and I taught her how to use it on the spot. If there's a legislation, whether it's timeline or a limitation on a class prior to, some people don't have that luxury. It's a nice thing to think about, but water sports is a recreational activity, and the right to self-defense is innumerable, and it cannot be infringed in that manner.
I see some of our panelists taking notes and just want to invite, if there's a question that you want to piggyback on or offer a different perspective, feel free to interject. All right, Clark, do you feel safe on campus? Wondering, what are some ways that you and your fellow students seek to protect yourselves, and if you feel as though your school is doing enough?
I don't feel like particularly protected on campus, I guess I will say. It seems as though our campus security and the police in the city of Columbia, I go to school in Columbia, Missouri at the University of Missouri, and it just seems that their priorities are a lot more focused on things that are not concerns of the community, of the students in the community, of the parents of the students in the community. It seems like there's no conversations happening between the community and its establishments. College kids underage, of age, are going to bars and are doing what college kids do, as you can imagine. And it seems that the focus of the police and all the authority is a lot more focused on underage drinking and having fake IDs, which I'm like, yes, okay, those are technical problems, but also there was a shooting down the block 5 minutes ago and nobody's there doing anything about it. There is a shooting every weekend for a certain amount of time in Columbia this year, and my mom was texting me frequently being like, are you okay? Where are you? What's going on? Like, why am I getting these emails every weekend? And I'm like, it's a great question. It seems like nobody seems to care about that kind of thing when you see all the police cars parked outside the bars or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I don't feel protected from gun violence particularly, so I guess I don't feel protected at all.
I see those questions are coming in, and want to assure you that we're going to get to those after. I got one more question for you, Representative Hoy. Are there things that the Kansas legislature can do to strengthen gun laws to help save the lives and protect the lives of Kansans in your community from gun violence?
Yes, and I'm going to start by giving you an example of two that we've already done in Kansas since 2017. First, Kansas passed the Personal and Family Protection Act back in 2013 that forced municipalities to have to allow guns in their buildings and on their premises. And as part of that, it started Guns on Campus, and there was a big concern about guns on campus in 2017 because some groups of buildings were exempt for a certain period of time before that law went into effect. And that included public health centers, mental health centers, nursing homes, and indigent care facilities. And though guns on campus did go into effect on July 1st in 2017, the Kansas legislature overwhelmingly passed a permanent exemption for hospitals, mental health centers, nursing homes, and indigent care facilities, and that law was allowed to go into law by then Governor Brownback. That was a huge step in a very sensible direction on saying those types of facilities should be able to make that decision for themselves. That's not in the hands of the Kansas legislature to make. Then in 2018, Kansas passed a law to mirror federal law for domestic violence, those convicted of misdemeanors, stalking, and restraining orders, to say you are prohibited from purchasing and possessing firearms for a certain period of time. It was already federal law, but without having that mirror state law, it made it difficult for local law enforcement to do anything about it, because that would only be federal law enforcement that had that jurisdiction. Another overwhelming support by the legislature, signed into law by then Governor Collier. So there are things that Kansans do agree on when it comes to protecting families. How can we build on this? There is one issue with the way the domestic violence law is enforced, and there isn't an enforcement mechanism that exists. So if you, upon those convictions, do want to comply with the law and you already own guns, you already have them in your possession, how do you relinquish those when you're now at risk of being in violation because you're in possession of those laws? We need to make it so that judges, upon those convictions, give out an order of relinquishment so that those individuals have a certain period of time where they take that order, they take it to law enforcement, they take it to a federally licensed gun dealer and relinquish that firearm, sell it, whatever their plan is for it, for the period of time that they are prohibited from being in possession of a firearm. We know that this type of law can help save lives, and domestic violence situations can become deadly when a gun is present. We also see background checks on all gun sales bills. Those have not gotten a hearing. Things like that have not really been discussed at length in the legislature. But the gun safety package that President Biden signed into law took a different approach than requiring background checks on all gun sales, and actually took a different approach of who is a federally licensed gun dealer. So now, if you show up at a gun show and you've just got, one heirloom gun or something that you wanted to sell, okay. But if you're routinely coming to these shows, or you're showing up with 12 guns and you're clearly in the business of being a gun salesperson, you need to get that federally licensed gun dealer or licensure, and you are going to have to now conduct background checks on your gun sales, because those individuals have been treated differently than like what you're talking about, the things that you're responsible and have to do. If you're not licensed and you're selling guns, you don't have to comply with those same regulations and rules as a federally licensed gun dealer does. And we know that background checks work. And we hear when there are these laws in place and you're not supposed to sell in the case if there's a straw purchaser, that they don't do it. So clearly some of these laws can help keep guns out of the hands of people with dangerous histories, or those who are not supposed to, by law, have them. So there's not one solution. There's a multiple gun laws that could help address different types of gun violence. And if some of those questions come up, I'll be happy to address more. But those are just my first thoughts. And also wanted to give you all a sense of hope that that things can and have and are being done here, even if it's just small incremental steps.
I believe Caleb has some perspective on this question.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide brief clarity, pardon me, to the point you just made about the FFL dealers. That's been standing law for quite some time. I believe the Biden administration may have tapered down the number that's occurred there, but we're very cognizant of that. The ATF has already been penalizing people who go to gun shows and who repeatedly have a turnover of arms. So if an individual purchases multiple handguns, for instance, we're required to file immediately what's called a multiple handgun sale form, which sends the serial numbers and everything to the sheriff's department, who then communicates with federal authorities in the event of seeing frequency of purchasing / sale of firearms from an individual. This happens very often at gun shows. You can look up case studies of this occurring where the ATF has penalized someone for illegally acting as an FFL dealer, whether it's out of their home or at gun shows, etc. And I think that's really the conversation that should be had here, is rather than passing laws that mirror things that already exist or mitigating things slightly, we take it from a different perspective, because frankly, all we're doing is we're burning time when we're not looking at real solutions.
I would add another circumstance that makes background checks on all gun sales necessary is online sales. There are a lot, like arms list, and there are a lot of transfers between individuals where background checks aren't occurring. So we don't have background checks on all gun sales. Some states have passed that and do have background checks on all gun sales, but here in Kansas, it is possible. And the reason that I know it's possible is because last year we passed a law to lower the concealed carry age from 21 to 18. Well, I don't know anyone who concealed carries long guns that 18-year-olds can go into a federally licensed gun dealer and purchase. And I don't think that you'd be able to sell a handgun to an 18-year-old.
That's correct, as a dealer, yeah.
So those individuals are going other places to be able to conceal carry now at age 18.
Absolutely. So in context to what's called like the online loophole, private sales are legal. They don't require a background check. We recommend, if you do a person-to-person transfer, to complete a bill of sale. In the event of a crime occurring with a firearm, what occurs is what's called an ATF trace. So that serial number is taken to the ATF, and because there's no federal registry of firearms, because it is illegal, and I think that's before I get too terribly far on the trace, that's why universal background checks can't work, because when we talk about these things like safe storage laws or universal background checks, they sound great because in theory they make sense. But we never talk about the enforcement mechanisms of these, right? And to enforce and guarantee that a background check is occurring on every firearm, the only way you can do so is by knowing precisely what I own. And that has been, by both federal law and the Heller decision, been stated unconstitutional, that we cannot have a registry of firearms at any level whatsoever.
Caleb,
Yes,
I've got to
please.
ask you to
No,
complete
please,
your
I'm
thought, and
sorry.
then, okay.
But that's really the point there, is that it's non-enforceable, and that's because it just doesn't work, and that's why private transactions they're acceptable, and we just need to understand that they do exist.
Thank you. I saw you pick up your mic. Did you have another point you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a couple of things. So why is there not permitted a federal registry? And my understanding is, and I could be wrong, that that's something that your industry has said we don't want to have happen. And so the very thing that could protect us, or at least help us to trace weapons, so you're arguing that we shouldn't do this because we don't have this ability to do it. It's unconstitutional, or I don't know if it's unconstitutional,
It is, yeah.
whatever is determined. And at the same time, that was something you fought, your industry, not you personally, fought to make sure that it wasn't allowed to have a federal registry. So
That's
I
correct.
guess I'm just saying,
Yeah.
it feels like there's a little bit of a circular argument here that,
Sure.
that okay, none of these things work because we can't do these things, and yet we're against those things if they could work. And I don't know, I'm not meaning to pick on you. I'm
No,
just saying
please.
This is the
I'm more
standard
than happy to
rhetoric
answer
from
that.
the-
Yeah. So the Biden administration has done a really great job of explaining why I need to advocate against laws like this. Just because both the Biden administration and the Obama administration, he was the pen and the phone individual, Barack Obama. He said, doesn't matter if it's legal, I can use my pen and my phone, we'll figure it out later. Joe Biden said the same things about executive orders. He's like, whether it's constitutional or not, it doesn't matter. If it saves lives, I'll do it. And then if it falls through the court, it falls through the court. And that's why we need to advocate against these things, because things can push through, but we never can verify, it takes case law. It takes it going up to the Supreme Court or going to a district court for these laws to be overturned. You know, like the National Firearms Act of 1934 is incredibly problematic, but it's not been faced inside the court of law. That does not mean historically it is not an unconstitutional law, for example. And
Caleb, I'm sorry.
No. But I think that's...
We got to pivot.
I understand. But to answer that question, it's because if it's not being tested, that's why.
Thank you. I've been on enough panels with Jaron and when he's chomping at the bit, so we got one more question for him before we go to audience questions. The connection between public health, public safety is a newer one for those outside of the public health sphere, and really want to get your perspective, not only on what's been addressed, because I see you taking notes, but what changes have you seen in the landscape that are driving an escalation in gun violence?
Thank you for the question. Can I get a preemptive ring? Okay, here we go. So here's the short answer, in my opinion. There's too many damn guns. There's too many damn guns. So let me share something with you guys. So there are enough guns in America for every man, woman, and child, and still 50 million left over. Most enumerated rights in the Constitution are for a public good. We have to ask ourselves, is there a public good in that? I can't see it. I can't see it. If we are at a point in America where we are having closed casket funerals for children and we don't do anything about it, we have to question our moral compass as a society, right? The other thing that concerns me is this constitutional carry kind of pattern that's coming across America. So there's over 50 states now that you can walk around with a handgun, open carry, without a permit, without a license. And it's another question that concerns me of what's the public good in that. I just don't see it. What often happens when you see someone in a public space with a firearm is you immediately get nervous, right? You immediately have some form of anxiety. And so what I view it as, we are really, in my opinion, catering to or pandering to a very small few with very little benefits outside of that.
Caleb?
Thank you.
I do appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. With respect, the thing that, to the point there on a select few of individuals, the past few years especially, we saw a surgence of 10 million on roughly new gun owners, first-time gun owners, and the majority of those individuals, over 50% were women, and the vast majority were also minorities as well. And that's, again, because of the significant increase in violence in watching cities burn with nobody doing anything to stop it. And to Clark's point as well, not feeling safe on campus, people feeling helpless, seeing law enforcement not where they should be in order to protect certain things. That's why people are going out and doing this. And so when I'm told that it's a select few of individuals, I've served every race, color, and creed proudly each and every day for the past 7 years of my life. And it's disparaging and disappointing to me when I hear people believe it to be something that it is not. And I think that's really, really important to contextualize that this is not the demographic that you believe it to be. Our business unit is directly built around the non-traditional shooters. So I see them every day, and it's really, really special.
Thank you. All right, so we've got a stack of audience questions somewhere. So we want to pause and take a moment here and check with our roving reporter, Savannah, and our fact checkers, Ashley and Amanda. Are there any questions or fact checks from the audience?
There are plenty of questions. We can start with fact checks if they want, or either way.
Let's start with fact checks.
Okay, we have a few fact checks. We've got one we're still working on. So the first question is it true that the U.S. is not in the top 10 regarding gun homicide rates, but our rate is 5 times as high? Some of these are hard to read, but...
As other OECD countries.
Correct.
So the United States is 11th in the world for gun violent deaths.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
So we are an outlier compared to other peer nations. All of the other countries that are above us are less wealthy nations. Or
your mic is going in and out.
Okay. Thank you. So, law enforcement It just wasn't on. Law enforcement officials are not obligated to protect citizens by law unless one is already in their law enforcement custody. So this regards the Parkland shooting, as stated, and
Can everyone hear the mics out again? I will hand you mine.
you.
Okay.
Not trip too. No, I'm not pushing it off. We think it's a dead spot right here. Okay.
Is that better?
U.S. District Judge Beth Bloom wrote that the critical question the court analyzes is whether defendants had a constitutional duty to protect plaintiffs from the actions of Cruz. She said that the plaintiffs would have to be considered to be in custody for such duty to exist.
Is that our final fact check of the
We
moment?
got one more. Could you please confirm how many armed citizens save lives? The Rand Institute looked at a number of surveys, studies, etc., and they came to the conclusion that the existing evidence for any causal effect of defensive gun use on reducing harm to individuals or society is inconclusive.
Thank you. All right, Savannah, turning to you.
Yeah, so I have quite a few questions. The first is for Representative Hoy. With the United States Congress passing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022, which, for those who might not know, expands background checks for individuals under the age of 21, provides $11 billion for mental health services, and then also prevents individuals who have been convicted of domestic violence from purchasing firearms for 5 years that are currently in relationships. But the key here is that it also provides $750 million for state grants to implement red flag laws that would allow authorities to confiscate firearms from individuals who have been determined by a court to be a danger to themselves or others. The question here is, will Kansas opt to adopt a red flag laws, or what is the Kansas legislature working on?
There have, gotta pause just a second for it to turn on. There has been a red flag law introduced over the past couple years. I'm not sure if it's always the same version. There hasn't been a hearing. But what the money that's going to be out there, there are going to be some opportunities for states that don't have red flag laws to participate in certain ways as well, because the intent of a red flag law is, family members, law enforcement, they're the first people to know when an individual is in crisis. And states that have already implemented these laws have been able to help prevent suicide. And I think the original thought was this was a good way to also help prevent certain mass shootings, because a lot of mass shooters do display similar warning signs, let's say, or have some, the FBI has certain profiles on mass shooters. And the very important thing to note on a red flag law is that it must have robust due process. These are temporary orders, and you will go before a judge, and so the individual will have that opportunity. So, and it's against the law to make a false claim, just as it is to make a false claim on any law. So I think that these red flag laws can save lives. They have saved lives in states that have them, and that the moment of time, especially in the case of suicide, to take that person and go before a judge, talk about this, and explain why you don't want them to be able to go buy a gun, or why they should temporarily relinquish the gun they already have. That alone could be enough to just get them out of that situation enough to move on and save their life or somebody else's. So I do believe that there can be funding opportunities in that bill for the state of Kansas as well.
And then I also would like to say on behalf of American Public Square that applause is not encouraged at these events, just to maintain civility in the audience, just like we would for the panelists. But yeah, so let's go on to our next question. So these two are kind of correlated. And the first is, why does anyone need an AK-47, assault rifle, or guns of that degree? The second is that, sorry, there's a lot of questions here. But the second is a question on, there is a correlation. Well, guns might not kill people, like Caleb said earlier. There is a correlation of certain kinds of guns being manufactured specifically for what most people see as violence, rather than a handgun or something for hunting, things like that. So these questions kind of evolved into, would the gun industry admit or be willing to address solutions and restrictions on guns that aren't necessary, or that most people don't believe to be necessary, or most people believe to be extra violent?
Sure. If I may. To answer that question simply, no. And I know that's an answer that many of you are unhappy with, but the reality of the situation is there's been mass shooting incidents with handguns where it's been reloaded 15 times because the magic number of how many rounds in the magazine doesn't work. Firearms are tools, and they are effectively used to stop threats. That is a true statement. Sport shooting, which we support and we enjoy very much in our industry, and what we do as a company, we are a entertainment business, and we enjoy giving people education for safety as well as fun. We make it fun. But the point being is that that is a secondary benefit to our right for self-protection, which includes and is not limited to firearms that are in common use. And so, again, when we refer back to Supreme Court law and what is actually possible, the Heller decision in 2008 gave us what we call the common use test. The common use test states that you cannot ban firearms that are in common use for the public sphere. The AR-15 has been around since the 1950s. Semi-automatic rifles have been along far before then. And the reality is, these cannot be banned underneath that clause. Now, we can pass a ban like they did in the 90s through 2004, and it was not contested in the court, as I mentioned earlier. Just because a law exists, and this was brought up in the most recent Bruin decision when they were talking about historical context of law and how it should be applied to the Second Amendment or any natural right. Just because a law has existed previously and was not contested in the court does not mean it passes constitutional muster. Simple as that. And so the reality is it just does, we don't see it as functional. Rifles are used in a very small subset of crimes. You're more likely to be murdered by someone with a hammer than you are a rifle, and that's unfortunate but true. And you can moan as much as you like on that, but that's FBI crime data. In the same way, the data I referenced earlier that was
Caleb,
fact-checked.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second to say I don't work for American Public Square, but I do believe moaning might be the same as applause. I do have a follow-up for you, Caleb. Another question, and Clark, I saw you raise your hand, so why don't you go before my follow-up question? That's a panelist.
I'll keep it kind of brief, sorry. Just a personal response to what you're saying and touching on what you're saying. I think everybody in here can admit that all instances of gun violence are, fatal and unfortunate and sad, no matter how it's happening. But I would personally take the side of protecting our youth and anybody with mental health issues that has access to any type of gun, or anybody in that kind of realm. I would rather protect and know that those groups of people are protected, rather than having the inevitable instances of not being able to protect yourself, maybe in public or wherever you are, and unfortunately losing your life. Because that is gonna happen no matter what. That is just what comes with life. I don't know if that's anything that can be completely removed, gun violence in its entirety, but I would definitely vote on the side of banning the guns that we need to ban to keep those demographics of people safe, our children and our mentally ill, and anybody who is undeservingly, to an extreme extent, dying because of gun violence, who's going to school as an 8-year-old and being afraid and having to buy a bulletproof backpack or anything like that. I would rather protect those people than constantly be on the side of, well, we do have the right to defend ourselves, because we absolutely do, but what is that worth all of everything that's been happening lately, all the stress that causes everybody?
A thought to add?
Sure, I was thinking through Caleb's discussion around the Supreme Court. So I think there's a couple things there. I think recently we've all learned a lesson that the Supreme Court doesn't always get it right, and we also should know that a long use of something or right doesn't necessarily mean that we have there's good use for it. So the AR-15 was created during Vietnam to knock through an enemy combatant's helmet from 500 feet away. I find it hard to understand why that would be in common use in day-to-day society. Can't understand it. I mean, there's going back to the Supreme Court argument for just a moment, right? So if you think through what the Supreme Court has decided in past cases, slavery, constitutional, right? Abortion for a long period of time was unconstitutional. There's a number of rights in America that, let's just say the Supreme Court doesn't always get it right. And so the challenge that the long-standing history of a deadly weapon, the use of it, is an argument that it should continue to be in society is difficult for me to understand. So that's it.
Reverend Hamilton, and then we'll move on to the next audience question.
Yeah, that was a great comment. Thank you. I was just thinking, I'd love somebody to fact check the number of people who die from hammers every year. I will after this, but I've never done a funeral for anybody who was killed with a hammer in our congregation, but I've done lots of funerals for people who died with guns. So
Okay, and so my next question is for Jaron. From a public health perspective, we have many questions. Wondering about the public health approach to violence prevention, and when does the risk of suicide fall to loved ones for safe securing of firearms instead of the laws made for everyone to pay for mental health issues for a few individuals?
Okay, I'm sorry. Repeat that for me one more time, please.
Yeah. So it's kind of a two-parter.
Sure, okay.
So this person wants to understand the public health approach to violence prevention. What are you doing in your role at SWIP Health to help prevent violence? But then on a personal side or an individual side, when does the risk of suicide prevention fall to loved ones for their safe securing of firearms for their loved one who might have a mental health crisis, who needs that gun secured, instead of laws that make everyone pay for the mental health issues of a few people? And I assume this person is meaning, since gun laws are not taking guns away from people who might go through a mental health event, how does that play into their personal life?
Yeah, great question. That's a setup, it feels like. Okay. Let me start with this. So recently, the United States introduced a kind of 911 equivalent called 988. It's a crisis hotline. Every city in America should have one. And the purpose of that hotline is to make sure that if someone is in crisis, they have a place to call, and law enforcement doesn't respond. Because law enforcement isn't always the appropriate people to respond. We have the contract for Jackson County. We work alongside University Health. It's been a slow trickle. The last 2 months, I believe we've had 4 responses, one of which ended up in having to institutionalize someone. But the point is, no one ended up being harmed, and that's what's critically important. So that's what I know that we're doing personally at SWIP Health. I will also mention, though, that I think it is much broader, the challenge, the problem. It's much broader and much more complicated than any one health system can respond to, right? We need appropriate funding for education to make sure that kids that could end up in a wayward way don't end up committing violence in any way, shape, or form. We need more public funding for public health. We need after-school programs. I mean, there's a number of things that we need to do to make sure that these things don't happen. But what was the last part of your question? Because I did think of something that
Yes.
the last part.
So when does it fall on the person?
Suicide, yeah, great question. So most of you guys know that most murders or most deaths in this country are based on suicide. My recommendation, and I'm not a clinician, I'm an administrator, and any clinician in here, I apologize that I'm an administrator. My recommendation is the moment you see any mental health issues with your loved one, report it. Report it, absolutely report it. There's been a number of lives that we probably could have saved if not for a mom and dad or loved one saying, well, I don't want to embarrass him. I don't want to institutionalize him. I don't want him to be surrounded with stigma, right? But at the end of the day, that is less important than that individual being alive, right? So that would be my recommendation, and I think we do our best to make sure that individuals that have any mental health issues or any signs of mental health crisis are surrounded by mental health professionals and people that love them.
And then my final question is for Clark. You said that you were exhausted and numb from the constant violence that your generation has had to experience. Where do you think we should go from here, and what laws or restrictions or policy moving forward would you support?
So I'm real heavy about that. I think everything needs to be reformed. Everything. Because everything intertwines into each other. We can't fix one thing if we're not fixing everything else at least a little bit. So I think we, as everybody's touched on, we need to touch on mental health issues, specifically in our men in categories 18 to 25. Just focusing on their ideas of what's the appropriate way of acting like the man that they want to be acting like. There's a lot of toxic masculinity in my generation that we've been dealing with for a long time, way too directly, and that directly coincides into gun violence. So definitely mental health, definitely background checks need to be reformed. Our communities need to be reformed. Our conversations need to be reformed, and we just need to be able to speak to each other, generation to generation or race to race or anybody. We need to be able to have these conversations, and they need to be instilled not just because we want to be having them, like everybody here showed up because they're wanting to have this conversation, but I don't think it should be optional anymore. I think you should be going to school and sitting in class, okay, this is how this gun works. There should be gun education. There should be toxic masculinity conversations. Like, that should be happening in our schools from the point of starting school to graduating. So at least we can have a firm foundation where we're mostly on the same page about it. You can still have a different opinion, but at least we're all in school and being able to say that we know the same things for a fact.
If back to our panel questions and revisit audience questions closer toward the end of the program. And so I'm going to come to you, Representative Hoy. In your opinion, how well do you feel the Kansas legislature has grappled with matters of gun control and gun violence? Do you feel like the laws have gone too far, not far enough? What's your perspective?
Kansas has gradually weakened gun laws over the past decade, and it has gone way too far. And I'm going to start back in 2010 and work you through some of that, and then let you know what I think the priority should be for legislation next session. So 2010 started with implementing a shoot first law, also known as Stand Your Ground, which changed Kansas self-defense laws. Then in 2013, shortly after what happened at Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut, the Kansas legislature passed the Personal and Family Protection Act, which forced municipalities and state facilities, public facilities, to have to allow guns. They no longer had the decision of whether or not they wanted to allow concealed carry in their premises. And that included the guns on campus, but it also includes for employees. So those employees of places like this, the library, swimming pools, city halls, their employees can carry and no questions asked. And it was like, the notion was, and the testimony was, more guns are going to make us safer. More people will be there to be able to protect ourselves. But they also, said, and don't worry, these are trained individuals. They have permits. It'll be fine. It'll make our community safer. But then in 2015, became permitless carry. So now people can carry in here and around our communities, no permit or training required. And I find it hard to believe, if somebody doesn't know how to use a firearm, how are they going to protect themselves or me? Then in let's see. So guns on campus went into effect. They said, we tried to stop it. We tried to get the permanent exemption, and we're told, don't worry, it's really just 21 and older. Not a lot of students are going to be old enough to carry anyway. And then last year, we now have 18, 19, and 20-year-olds can still carry with a permit. And already on the books, we've already discussed background checks on all gun sales aren't required. So, 18-year-olds working in the library, working at the swimming pool, if they get a permit, can carry around a handgun that they had to buy through some deal that outside of a federally licensed gun dealer. So we're really setting young Kansans up for trouble here with this law. And I think it was a mistake, and I stood strong against it, and we only needed one more vote to be able to defeat that dangerous bill. So we are getting closer. We are making progress, and saying how close that was, now going back to 2010, that bill passed unanimously. So what do we need to do to get back on track and start bringing some more common sense with some of these? Kansas self-defense law has now been on the books for 12 years, so we have an understanding of the consequences of this law. And I want to start off by saying nobody should ever have a duty to retreat inside their own home. That's a basic self-defense law anyway. That's something that you're already going to be protected on. But the broad interpretation of stand your ground I've had conversations with a district attorney, and I said, have people in Kansas gotten away with murder because of this law? And he said, yes. So what can we do about it? The way that the law was written made it seem like it was just a simple self-defense, but the initial aggressor part of the law makes it so that there are very limited and specific clarifications for what that means. So if you go in and you punch somebody in the face and then they punch you back, then you can use self-defense, lethal use of force with no duty to retreat, even if you could clearly and safely walk away. We need to make it so that if you are the initial aggressor, you can't use deadly force. You can't instigate these arguments and then shoot and kill that individual and provoke them in that way. We also have in our law the immunity. So we need to eliminate the pretrial immunity. If you shoot and kill someone in self-defense, you should have to go before a court. That's the way it used to be. You used to have to go to trial, and now somebody who uses deadly force, we have made it easier for them to walk away free without a trial, and we need to address that circumstance. We also need data. This law has been on the books for a while. We've seen what this law has done in other states like Florida, with Trayvon Martin and that just a horrifying tragedy. We need the KBI to report these use of force cases. We need judicial administration to let us know and provide that data of how many people are truly walking away without any trial, and be able to look at this closer. Maybe these are situations where it's justified use of force. This law, as we've seen in other states with a law like it, is increasing vigilantism, like we saw with Rittenhouse up north, and it's made it really a license to kill. And it's extreme, and we've got to reform it and get it back on track, because if you can clearly and safely walk away, then why are we allowing individuals to use deadly force in those circumstances?
Representative Hoyt, I hate to cut you off. I'm doing my best to keep time, and we're running out of it.
I'm good.
Kayla, if you wanted to provide a brief, different perspective.
Very brief. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think the most important thing that I'd like to address is the concerns about permitless carry, because I do think that there's a lot of confusion about how that works. For all states, that only exists within the state in which you reside. And the reason why I bring that up, and the reason why that's a really important point, is I crossed the state line 3 times today without even meaning to. And you will do that in the Kansas City Metropolitan very, very easily. If I'm carrying a firearm concealed and I cross state lines, I am now committing a felony in Kansas without a permit, I should say, as someone who does not have a permit, whereas my concealed carry permit allows me to carry reciprocity within 34. So we encourage, and we've seen constitutional carry in both Kansas, Missouri, and now actually in all 3 states in which we have stores, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, constitutional carry has passed. And overwhelmingly, our concealed carry classes are still full. We have not seen a reduction in individuals coming in. In fact, quite the opposite. People are getting trained. People are taking the time to do so. And that's the reality. In fact, we saw a massive surge in concealed carry permit applications over the past few months as well. And that's the truth of the matter. So it means you can go to your local store or stay within your region, but if you want to travel any more than a couple miles, there's a good chance you're going to get your permit because it just makes sense.
So why not have the laws requiring it? If this is the case,
Sure.
why not go ahead and say this is a requirement?
Yeah, so the training requirement for the concealed carry permit, I do recommend. We have a really great video on our YouTube channel discussing what concealed carry is and what reciprocity is and how it works with one of our instructors. And the reality is the concealed carry permit is like getting your learner's permit for driving. It's an 8-hour course in the state of Missouri and Kansas that basically gives you a super face value explanation of what use of force laws are and how they work. And it's not enough to really fully understand. And the reality is it's not enough to really consider training. And anything more is problematically removing you from access to your natural right to be able to defend yourself and increasing that time span between buying a firearm and being able to utilize it. And it's your personal responsibility to do so. And we encourage that with our clients each and every day. And that's why training is a lifelong journey. That's why we say continued education is the most important thing. And that's why we see students and members and clients who do that each and every day.
All right,
It's
I'm
not
gonna
the
have to
responsibility of
shift
the government to
Caleb.
make that
I
happen.
apologize. And I'm going to ask for my own bell in a moment because I hear the murmurs and all that. We've got to, keep it civil. And I don't know if there's some fact checking going on, but I see Representative Hoy on her phone. I think she's doing some fact checking of her own. But I'm going to go back to you, Jaron. And I'm having to hold myself back as a public policy professional myself. But as a public health leader, as a lawyer, as an advocate, as a health administrator, what do public health leaders need to do to play a role in policy changes? What policy changes are necessary when it comes to addressing gun violence in our communities?
Yeah, great question. So the first part of your question about what we need to do, I think we're doing it, right? So a lot of gun violence is finally being considered a public health issue, which is a good thing. And that gives way to public health professionals, administrators, physicians, psychiatrists to engage in this. What I don't see, and I think we need to do a much better job of, is the way we engage the lobby group that are already doing a lot of this work and have been doing it for decades in a very effective way, right? Typically, the American Medical Association and other lobbies that are in healthcare, they lobby for healthcare legislation, right? We want to make sure that patients have access and a number of things dealing with day-to-day healthcare operations. What we probably could do a much better job of is working with organizations that are in the Kansas State Legislature, Missouri State Legislature already doing this work, right? That's the short answer to that question is we need to do a much better job of lobbying. The gun lobby in America is not undefeatable, right? But there are things that we can do to make sure that we have balanced and respectable gun laws, but we have to engage in the fight to begin with.
Thank you. Clark, if the argument that mass shootings and the morality of our youth are not enough reasons to address gun control, what other reasons may help persuade citizens to meet in the middle?
Not to sound like a broken clock or anything, but all the reasons that we've already mentioned for sure. Specifically the mental health aspect of it and just the amount of gun accidents that happen every year is ridiculous. A lot of people that are probably closer to those problems than you thought, and a lot of people are probably directly affected by those problems. I personally have struggled a lot with mental health issues growing up, and I don't know if I could confidently say that if I knew where a gun was located in my house, that I wouldn't be part of a statistic. And just knowing that is makes my stomach hurt. It's just sickening to hear and to understand that that anybody in that position, knowing that there's a gun in the home or knowing that they have access to a gun, has so much power in their hands just by knowing that one thing, and can change their life and the lives around them. So it's just so important to, if you're gonna own a gun, to understand how it works. And if you're someone of my age or living in a household with your parents who might be gun owners, it's definitely important to, I guess, not understand where the gun is located in your house, because, if you're struggling with mental issues like that, it could definitely change your life. So I would say the mental health aspect of it and the gun accidents for sure. As I stated earlier, it doesn't feel too bad until it happens to you or until you're directly affected by it. And that's a big thing that I try to advocate through everything I talk about is there needs to be a lot more sympathy and empathy in society right now for people who are going through those things and for your loved ones. You know, that's a basic human emotion that I feel like I see none of anymore. We all like to talk and think we understand, but are we really feeling like we're understanding what our loved ones and even people we don't know are going through? So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Jaron, you, and then Reverend Hamilton, if you would address this question as well, because I know this is close to home for you particularly.
All right.
Sharon.
So 2 quick kind of policy suggestions that I've kind of always considered to be fairly common sense, right? So what's the age in Kansas to get a gun, to buy a gun? 18? For a long gun. What about a handgun? 21. Okay. Okay. So it concerns me that you can get a gun and carry it before you can even vote, right? But I've always considered or been curious as to why there isn't a preliminary permit, right? So if you're a 16-year-old and you get a permit to drive, right, it's provisional, right? It's just for a little bit of time and then you can permanently drive, right? I think we should consider doing that for 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds that are getting handguns. That's the first thing. The second thing, for mental health, at Swope Health, we do these things called well child exams. If you have a child, you likely know what that is, right? Well child exams typically don't include mental health diagnoses, any type of mental health screenings, and they should. And they absolutely should, right? It's a common sense way to ensure that your child is on the right track and mentally healthy. And it takes 10 seconds to ask a depression screening, to do a depression screening, make sure they can have access to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. It's common sense. It could avoid some pain in the future. Thanks.
Reverend Hamilton.
Question?
Sure. Just what we can do from a policy perspective and what you would encourage members of your congregation to do to get more active around this issue.
Yeah. So one of the things that is critical, we recognize that most people who own guns are going to handle them safely. They're going to not shoot people. They're not going to use them for violence. Most people who in my congregation have guns, I have zero fear of them murdering somebody with their gun. Now, I say I have zero fear, and yet I've seen people who are mentally not well in our congregation who actually used guns on their spouses. And so, but generally speaking, that's the case. I think to figure out what are the solutions at a systemic level in our country for addressing the largest number of violent crimes happening with guns is important. Now, again, in cases the gun lobby didn't want the federal government for a long time to even study these questions. And so that, we, as opposed to actually saying this is a real issue we need to study. But I think part of this is not going to happen with more gun laws, even though I think we need more common sense gun laws. I think part of this is investing in young people. It's investing in children. It's investing in kids who are at risk communities where there's a more likelihood that something could happen. We know most of the murders that happen are in low-income communities, and most of them are violent crimes that are happening among people of color, younger people of color who are engaged in this. And part of what we have to ask, I think, is how are we investing in our children and our youth in our schools if we're going to solve part of this? I think there are some laws that have to pass. There are some mental health issues we've got to address, some serious mental health issues we have to address, and then we have to be investing in children and youth. And I think as a congregation, that's something that we have spent a lot of time and a lot of our resources on, and I think is really important. And I think about, again, when Aaron Langhofer was killed, there's a young person. So I go to the hearing, and I'm watching as this kid who's, I forget, he was 17 years old maybe. And I don't know what gun laws could have kept him from getting a gun when 360 million guns exist in our country. But I'm looking at this kid, and I'm sitting behind him, and I'm there to support the Langhofer family as this kid comes in, but I'm watching he's raised by his grandmother because his parents aren't actively involved in his life. I'm seeing his family members crying. I'm seeing this kid looks like he's dressed up in an oversized suit as he's coming in, and I'm like, this kid's whole life is ruined. And I felt compassion for him while I'm there to support a family who's, and one of my young people who died as a result of this, but I thought somewhere this kid needed some more care and support along the way. And I think we have to look at a more comprehensive way of addressing these issues, and it's not as simple as just if we just pass this one gun law, it's going to fix it. We have to look at some things, and I hope your industry would be able to, I get, it's frustrating. I know you all feel this as well. You have really good answers, and I appreciate you're a smart guy. And at the same time, I think all I ever hear, it feels like from your side is, no, none of these things are going to work, and none of these laws are going to work. And I'm like, then tell us what you think might help. And I know I've heard some of the arguments, and some of them, but anyway, I just think we've got to work together, and we have to work together, because there's a whole lot of gun owners in our country, and we can't just say, well, demonize them, and they've got answers to almost every argument that you would make. You've heard these. And I think somewhere we've got some combination of all of those things. It's investing in children and youth. It's investing in mental health. It's recognizing that we've glamorized using violence in video games and other things. And the last piece, and this is just true for a lot of us, is we're afraid. As a country, we're afraid. And most of the people who are afraid and go buy guns are not going to commit crimes. But we are so driven by fear in our country that we can't feel safe unless I have my gun in my back pocket or something else. And that is also not healthy for any of us, and
Reverend
it's not
Hamilton,
realistic.
I apologize. We are running out of time, and the library will kick us out.
Do I have time for a quick fact check?
May I?
Well, we're
possibly
going to
respond
turn
the
it over to
policy question?
Savannah. We're going to turn it over to Savannah and our fact checkers to do exactly that, because I know we still have about half a stack of questions left. Or no? Yes. Okay.
So our first question is, firearms are banned in locations such as New York and Chicago. Has incidents there gone down? So firearms are legal in Chicago and in New York. The Associated Press did a fact check actually on this, so they made our job really easy. Handguns are as legal in Chicago as they are in Dallas, says a law professor from Stanford University. Still, gun laws in Chicago and Illinois are strict. In Illinois, background checks and permits are required for purchasing firearms. States like California and New York generally have stricter gun laws than Illinois, and those states have lower crimes related to guns.
Any more fact check? Sure.
Our next one is, did the Supreme Court invalidate all safe storage laws in Heller? So this is referencing to District of Columbia v. Heller. The American Bar Association states that arguments that safe storage laws would necessarily violate the Second Amendment as established in District of Columbia v. Heller are unavailing. In Heller, the United States Supreme Court considered a challenge to the D.C. law that totally banned handgun possessions in the home and required that any lawful firearm in the home be disassembled or bound by a trigger lock at all times, rendering it inoperable. Ultimately, the court held that the law-abiding responsible citizens have a right to keep a handgun in the home for self-defense. At the same time, Heller made clear that the Second Amendment is not unlimited and laws restricting commercial sales are permitted. Under this framework, the court held that DC's law was unconstitutional because it required residents to render their handguns completely inoperable, thereby infringing the Second Amendment right to self-defense. In contrast, courts across the country have routinely found that safe storage laws that require practices such as keeping firearms in locked containers or using trigger locks do not infringe on self-defense rights.
Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions, and I'm also going to ask in the interest of time for brief answers. The first one is for Jaron. Does the Second Amendment, and also I would like to hear an answer from Reverend Hamilton as well. We'll start with Reverend Hamilton. The Second Amendment, does it supersede rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And in your view, from a religious perspective, the right to life and agency? And what would you do to address mental health issues within that field? So for Jaron and Reverend Hamilton.
In 3 minutes.
Right.
Well, I think from a moral and a biblical theological perspective, I would say that murdering another human being is not, I don't know that that's the question they were asking, but we're all going to agree that's not a good thing. And so there were people who had, there's 477 mentions of swords in the Bible. So clearly people had weapons of some kind to defend themselves. And at the same time, Jesus' response to that was that, and actually the Old Testament as well, is that we don't trust in our weapons for our security or for addressing our fear. And so that's a convoluted question, and I wish I had more time to answer, but I would just say, I think about I think about Jesus who recognized that his disciples had swords, and then he told them not to use them. This is the night, I just finished writing a book on Luke, and this is the night that he was going to be arrested, and he says, you have 2 swords, don't use them. And so it's kind of an interesting question when it comes to just biblically, but I do think we are meant to respect life, and I think we are to work for a more just, caring, and safe society, and that includes some question about how we address guns and what we do with them, and even though I have the right to do something, is it right for me to do it? Is it, so I think sometimes it's not even about rights, it's just what's the right thing for me to do, and so.
Yeah, and Jaron, again, the question, does the Second Amendment supersede the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? And from a mental health perspective, how can we balance those out?
Yeah, the short answer to the first question is no, but it's the Reverend's answer, it's a convoluted question. The point that I was making earlier is whether or not there's a good use of all the guns in America, and the fact that we've normalized the amount of guns and the violence that we have in this country. That's the issue. I don't know if it's an issue of whether or not it supersedes it. To your second question about mental health, here's the challenge. I think we've intentionally, maybe unintentionally, maybe I'll say unintentionally, we've unintentionally created a stigma around mental health for no apparent reason, right? It should be fairly normal, okay? If you go to the doctor for a primary care visit, you should be able to answer questions around your mental health as a regular part of your visit. And you shouldn't have to see a separate physician, a psychiatrist, a mental health institution, a community mental health center to do that. And so for some reason, and I take blame in that as someone who works in healthcare, for some reason we've separated those 2 practices of medicine in a way that makes people uncomfortable, and we have to do a better job of that.
And then the final question is for Caleb. The Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act, which for those who do not know, prevents local law enforcement from enforcing federal gun restrictions, rules, or laws, was signed into law at Frontier Justice. Caleb indicated it isn't worth the time to pass mirroring laws for local law enforcement to be able to enforce federal law. Does Frontier Justice support the Second Amendment Preservation Act and nullifying federal laws in Missouri that do not have state mirrors?
That's a really great question, and I think it comes down to the contextualization of what the Second Amendment Protection Act, or SAPA, is what it actually does. What it establishes is that additional orders or attempts by the government that violate individuals' rights cannot be enforced. It has not changed our day-to-day operations, adhering to federal law, or working with the ATF, or processing background checks, or doing anything with standard laws that are on the books. That is the simple answer there, which is why mirroring is, in our mind, not relevant, because truly what it's meant to do is, in what Eric Schmidt just did recently, the FBI is attempting to garner and glean as much information and data in an attempt to create a registration of who's actually carrying firearms. The FBI attempted to reach out to our Attorney General in the state of Missouri for information that they cannot have about who has concealed carry, names, information, et cetera, to get that information. And because of the Second Amendment Protection Act, we were able to tell him no. That matters because that violated pre-existing federal law to even attempt to do so. And by giving our states, by allowing them to use their 10th Amendment rights to further protect our citizens from unconstitutional overbearing processes is incredibly important. And there's so much more to unpack that I'd like to be able to talk about, and I understand the time is limited, but that is the short answer there. It was our honor to have that bill signed on our floor. I was there that day. I was feet from it happening, and it was incredible. Something that I was very proud to be a part of.
Thank you.
Are past time. I'm looking for direction on whether or not we need to wrap it. Okay.
Yeah, let's wrap it up. Let's do so what and now what.
Okay.
And we'll wrap it up.
All right. So this is a question for all of our panelists, and it's a way for us to sort of collectively discuss, or at least conceptualize a way forward together. It's been a robust conversation, which might leave one wondering, is there a way forward? Is there some common ground that we can all agree to? And I'd like to hear your ideas about potential path forwards for actionable common ground. And within that, if you can also address the so what, now what question that we wrap these conversations with, which just, about this conversation, if you had to put it in a nutshell, so what, now what? Starting with you.
Sure. I appreciate that, as I didn't have the opportunity to address what you had mentioned about what we can do or what the lobby believes or firearms owners in general believe is necessary. We say no a lot, and I understand the frustration with that because we understand that by focusing on an implement rather than the action, we have significant issues. One more brief example of how that works. In 2018, London's murder rate per capita overseeded New York City's with blades. Violence exists in the heart of man. That's a fact. By legislating away tools, we don't prevent that from happening. So how do we fix things? And everything you referenced is precisely our recommendations, which is education, which is helping our individuals rise out of poor socioeconomic situations, helping our children. These are the things that are complex issues that don't score simple and rapid political points like a ban might. And it's not easily tracked or traced. But these are the things, the hard questions that require us to answer, require more effort, which is precisely why we advocate against such measures because, again, using the phrase hollow hope, we put so much time, so much energy, and so much equity into fighting a tool rather than fighting root causes of violence. And when we do that, people are still dying each and every day, and that will not change. So for us, it comes down to helping people out of situations, giving them the tools that they need to get out of hard mental health, situations that they're in, and getting them uplifting people out of poverty. This is important. This is our role as a society. So for the so what, now what? So what? This is a natural right. And I'm happy to provide any more contextualization to sources utilized or anything like that to explain. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. Whether you agree with an institution's ruling, whether you agree with laws that are on the books, you were born with an opportunity to have a life. And you were born with the right to ensure that that life does not end early. Simple as that. So now what? We need to work together to build a better society, to build one where people aren't living in poverty, where people aren't gunning each other down, and more importantly, where 2/3 of all gun deaths in America aren't suicide.
Thank you, Caleb. All right. We've got no clapping. We laid the ground rules early. No one gets to clap. All right. So we're gonna, sir, please. Sir, please. All right. So if we could elevator pitch 1 to 2 minute responses, starting with you, Reverend Hamilton.
I would just reiterate what I said. I think we've got to recognize it is a complex issue. We wish it was simple, and if we just pass this law, all be okay. There are common sense things that seem like they would make a difference. I think we do have to look at how do we in particular do what we can to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, and that's complex as well. But like most of you, I sat and listened to the news, and listening when they finally played the tape of the guy shooting the kids in Uvalde, and I'm just like everybody, any gun owner would feel the same way, but just weeping, thinking, what do we do to address this? This cannot be what we are as human beings. We've got to feel, and so I don't have the answer. I just think there is some combination of working together, figuring out how groups are working together, because the gun owner's not going to disappear, and the folks who are struggling with gun rights are not going to disappear. We got to figure out how we work together, and we got to look at what is the real problem. The real problem isn't the average person who owns a gun, but the real problem is people who sometimes have guns in their homes, and kids end up getting them and misusing them and take their own lives. Sometimes it's young people who, again, most school shootings, the average age of the school shooter is 17 years old. Where did they get the guns? How did that happen? How do we keep them from accessing guns? So it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's.
Thank you. I understand it's difficult to keep it short. Representative Hoy.
I believe that we will end the gun violence crisis. I believe it will happen. It's not easy. It will take time. In 2015, Kansas implemented permitless carry, and in fact, the number of permits issued dropped dramatically each year until 2021. There was a large increase during the pandemic for that big boost of sales, up 141%, still below the number issued as reported by the Attorney General back in 2015. That report will come out in the next couple of weeks for the next year. I'll be interested to see if it increases due to the concealed carry reciprocity, and now the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds can get those permits. And when you look at this happening over the course of those years and look at violent crime, go to the violent crime index put out by the KBI. These laws didn't protect our communities. Guns in the hands of untrained and potentially dangerous people did not make our communities safer. Violent crime has increased, and sensible gun laws will save lives.
We definitely just need a new filter in how everybody is viewing the world. These kinds of conversations cannot be so competitive anymore. Also, it's a numbers-based conversation, surely, but it's a people-based conversation. Like, at the end of the day, we're all people, and we're all trying to wake up and go to bed and live our little lives and have our little fun. You know, like, it's not. It shouldn't just be so hostile and competitive anymore. But by getting to that point, we're just gonna have to reform everything and make sure that our emotions are included in these conversations. I know maybe that makes me a snowflake, but it's important. We're emotion-based beings, so we need to take that into account.
Thank you. Jaron?
Thank you. I'm not sure if I have an answer. This conversation is really troubling because it seems like we are in a place in terms of rhetoric where the ability to disagree makes you an enemy, right? I laugh now because the other side of the aisle for me used to be reasonable. Now I find them to be deplorable. And I'm almost certain that those on the other side of the gun issue or political issue probably feel the same way about me, right? And to the Reverend's point, we just got to find a way to agree. My challenge is, it seems to be that every alternative solution we offer is a non-starter. You have to recognize that there's a problem first before we make any headway, right? So, Caleb, I'm going to tell you something. You mentioned education, poverty, mental health, and I appreciate those because I do think those play a role in violence. What I'd like to do is invite the gun lobby and those who I think you've passionately represented tonight to donate 30% of their profits to those challenges. That would make me, I believe, feel a lot more. I would feel that the causes and the challenges that you guys present as a reason for gun violence, I would believe you to be genuine if you are presenting dollars and resources to those problems that you think are creating that violence, right? So that's it. Thank you.
We must wrap at this point, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Lauren, to close this out.
First, I want to extend a huge thank you to tonight's panelists, our fabulous moderator, our roving reporter, our fact checkers, and our volunteers. I am going to allow applause at this point. Remiss if I didn't recognize our fabulous host for this evening, the Johnson County Library. So, you're going to receive an email from us with a survey, and I implore you to fill it out because your feedback will help shape future programming. So do take the time, a few minutes to fill that out. American Public Square relies on the support of its members to engage, educate, and convene with a diverse variety of perspectives, as we did just tonight. If you are an APS member, thank you. Simple enough. We know that you have a choice in how you spend your time and your resources, and we are honored that you chose to spend this evening with us. If you're not yet a member of APS and you found this evening's conversation meaningful, perhaps challenging, or even if you left with more questions than you came with, I invite you to become an APS member. You can visit AmericanPublicSquare.org or simply stop at the registration table on your way out and we'll get you signed up. As a small token of our appreciation for anybody that joins this evening, we're not only going to give you one membership, we're going to give you a membership to share because we believe that the best things in life are shared, and so we invite you to do that with someone that you think would benefit from the work of American Public Square. I hope that you have put September 13th on your calendar. That's our next program that will be hosted by the Truman Presidential Library. It will be another fascinating conversation, so we hope to see you there. On behalf of our founder, Alan Katz, our executive director, Claire Bishop, and the entire APS team, thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you in the future. In the meantime, be well and be safe.